All right. So hopefully that's showing up for everyone. Again, thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Caitlin Metzger. I'm the Deputy Director of You Can Vote, and just so excited to be here today. Recognize a lot of the names, but want to just really focus on what's on the ballot coming up, especially in the primary as opposed to the general, and then some communications best practices for making sure that students are registered, empowered, and educated about why voting matters in 2024. I think a lot of times, people who are lifelong voters think, of course, everyone's going to vote because you think it's important. But our organization is a nonpartisan organization, and the reason we exist going into our 10th year this year is to increase voting literacy and civic engagement. What we find is that a whole lot of people in North Carolina want to vote and are interested, but the rules change often, right? We see different voter ID laws. We see different polling places happening. We see different primary election days. Sometimes they move to May. There are changes that happen every single year. And so what we do at You Can Vote in a nonpartisan, nonprofit way is make sure that folks know what the rules are. And just like the name says, you can vote every single year that you're eligible. You just need to know the basics of what's happening and mechanics for this year. So the reason that we exist, like I said, is because we want to talk to new voters, especially people just moving to North Carolina or just turning 18 for the first time. We find that young voters, really anyone, I'm talking about anyone under 40, this might be the first time they're voting, especially in a primary. So we want to make sure that people know what their rights are and know how to make their voice heard this year. We are volunteer-based. We started as a 3-person team in Durham and have expanded and grown. Our reach is in about 65 counties right now. And many of you have worked with some of our organizers across the state, but we have a lot of volunteers. We have civic fellows and interns, and we have a headquarters here in Durham, but have regional offices in Jacksonville, Wilmington, Greensboro, Forsyth, Mecklenburg, Raleigh, and Durham. And then have hundreds of other volunteers across the state who come do tabling events and come do presentations, as well as a full suite of ongoing virtual trainings that I know many of you have attended, but we'll continue to have that presence both in person and virtual to make sure that everyone has what they need to vote in 2024. So first things first, I want to make sure you're registered. One of our best practices for communication is making sure that people who are in a position of power, or at least maybe the adult in the room when talking to young people, make sure you're registered, right? A lot of our best communication practices have to come with telling your voting story. And so I want to just encourage everyone on the call to make sure you're registered this year. The lookup tool there has changed the way it looks. That is a short link that goes to the State Board of Elections, but has slightly changed this year. And so again, that's a best practice for every single year. Go to that short link, put in your first name, last name, search, and just make sure that your address, your registration address is where you currently live. Several of the counties have already uploaded the sample ballot. Not all of them, but I expect most of them or all of them will certainly be in the next couple days or weeks. You can also see at that site where you go vote on election day, if that's your choice. You can see your voter history. You can see all kinds of information. Another great practice there, because we live in North Carolina, is that our maps change often. And so especially once I get to the congressional office, I'll encourage you to look yourself up again because we do have new maps that you might be voting in for the first time. Make your voting plan. I'm going to keep talking about this, kind of like Olivia kept saying, May 31st, May 31st. I'm going to keep talking about making your voting plan because, again, when you can share your experience and your voting plan, that empowers other voters to start thinking about it, right? We do have 3 ways to vote in North Carolina. You can vote early, which is always our #1 best option. Election day, which is March 5th and November 5th this year. And then absentee voting, which I'll touch briefly on, but as Adam mentioned at the beginning, those rules have changed a bit and it's a little bit more difficult. So we recommend early voting. Election day is an option. Absentee is an option. But I would just really encourage you to remember that in order to have the option of all three ways, you have to be registered. So we do have same-day registration still offered at early voting. But if you choose to vote on election day, or if you choose to vote by mail, you've got to be registered first. So again, make sure that your address is current. If you've had a name change, if you want to make a political party change, now's the time. Get registered and start to think about your voting plan. And then the last point here is generally one of our good talking points to talk to young people. But bringing your friends and empowering your community. Like I said, we think about voting kind of like a team sport. Every single person, of course, has their own individual ballot, but we do find that it is more likely that people go vote if they make a plan with another person. So bring your friends, right? Text your friends, invite them. Hey, I'm going on this day to this location for early voting. Do you want to come with me? Those kind of invitations to vote as a team or as a group are often more successful. So one thing that we will have, it's not quite ready yet, but we'll send out via email as a communications toolkit. Coming up for the primary, we have sample social media, sample email blasts, all that information about sharing the communication out to your campus. All right, and then very briefly, I know Adam talked about this too, but I just want to make sure when we talk about the primary coming up, you know, we live in North Carolina, so we tend to talk about it kind of like a basketball game analogy. And oftentimes students will ask you, like, why do we even vote in a primary, right? What's the difference between a primary and a general? It's really important that you're able to answer that question because the primary is a little bit odd, right? If you think about a voter who maybe has never voted before, or maybe in 2020 in the general election was their first time voting, or even 2022 in the general election, that might have been their first time voting. A presidential primary is quite different, right? We have different rules for the primary, and especially for unaffiliated voters. I'm going to talk about that in 1 minute. But why do we vote in the primary? We like to kind of, you know, just say it's kind of like the Final Four game, right? We have a whole lot of names on the ballot, depending on which ballot you want to choose if you're unaffiliated. And the primary election is where we whittle that down, right? We're whittling down the names of what we're going to see on the general election ballot. And so sometimes the decisions are made in the primary, depending on how many people are running or how many parties put up candidates. Sometimes in North Carolina, the primary election makes the decision, excuse me, and the outcome is known as of March. So we do want to increase participation in the primary. Another key fact to remember is that the biggest impact you can make for turnout in North Carolina is to build that habit of voting. Voting in the primary election this year basically guarantees that people are going to vote in November. Same thing we said last year for the municipals. If we can get folks voting in their municipal elections, their likelihood of continuing to vote every single time they're eligible increases. And what the national data shows is that once voters vote 3 times in a row, 3 elections that they're eligible in, they're probably going to be a lifelong voter, right? And so that is why we don't focus on as much as on older citizens or voters who have been voting for a long time, because they gotta kind of have it down, right? They're in the habit, they know what to do, they know where to look. So at You Can Vote, and of course why you are here today is to focus on student voters. And so we really don't want to skip over the primary election because important decisions are made. And this year, every single county has an election, which was not the case in 2023. So at a snapshot, if you need to take these dates down again, March 5th, hope you have that on your calendar. November 5th, that's the general election. That's where we are in 2024. All right, and then as I mentioned, I just want to briefly talk about who can vote in the primary, because that can be a little bit confusing, especially for new voters. In North Carolina, we have 5 recognized parties. And so in order to vote in the primary, you have to be registered. And if you want to vote in that political party's primary, you have to be registered. So if you're a Republican voter, you vote in the Republican primary. If you're a Democratic voter, you vote in the Democratic primary. If you're a Libertarian voter, you vote in the Libertarian primary. However, we have two other parties. So Green Party and No Labels Party, those are recognized in North Carolina. However, they did not run enough candidates to have a primary, or they have a different type of primary, like the No Labels Party does convention. So if you're registered as Green Party or No Labels Party, you won't have a March primary ballot. And why does that matter? If you're talking to a student and if you're doing the voter lookup and looking to make sure their address is correct, and you scroll to the sample section and it says none, they might be confused, right? I'm a registered voter. I did everything you told me to do. I changed my address. You're telling me that voting in the primary is important. Why don't I have a ballot? That's why. Because Green and No Labels Party don't actually have a primary this year, but they will be able to vote and they will have a ballot, because since we all share the same ballot in November. So that's one key takeaway that I hope you can remember, or at least know where to look if you're confused, is that there's 5 parties in North Carolina, but 3 of them have a ballot this year for the primary. Now, the biggest group of people, unaffiliated voters, those are also called independent voters. The vast majority of young people are not choosing a party, right? That's probably a common conversation that you've had. People either don't want to pick a party, or they don't know enough about the parties to choose, or maybe they're just hurrying really fast through the voter registration form, and since that's an optional box, they don't check anything. But if you're unaffiliated in North Carolina, you can still vote in the primary. This is one of the biggest things we need your help educating new voters about, is that just because you didn't pick a party does not mean that you're counted out, right? You can still vote in the primary. What happens is, if you're unaffiliated, is on your sample ballot lookup, when you do the lookup with your first name and last name, you'll see options, right? I mean, depending on your county, you'll see the options of 3 different ballots. When you go to vote, you choose which one you want. So it does look a little bit different, right? You'll see lots of options there. And folks might see different offices on those ballots. So I'll talk more about that in 1 minute. But for example, we have about 24 races on the ballot this year. Not every office has a primary for every single party, because they might not have run multiple candidates, right? But some offices for certain parties have 7 different options for one office, right? So it can vary by the office as well as the party. And I do want to mention again, of course, you can only vote 1 ballot. So there are 3 different options, but if you're unaffiliated, you can only choose 1. So you're going to have to make that choice and vote that 1 ballot in the primary. There are a couple counties that will have a nonpartisan ballot. Generally, that's for school board, but it might not be any other races. So that's why that says if available or if applicable. Again, use that voter lookup tool. See what your options are, because although every single county in North Carolina has an election this year, meaning there's something on the ballot for everybody, it might be a little bit different in the primary. Again, just based on who ran in which party's primary, how many options there are. Sometimes if only 1 person ran for Congress in that district, you're not going to see them on the primary because it's 1, right? But you will see them in November. And so again, I just encourage everyone to think about, when you're having these conversations with students, or if you're pointing them to us and using the tools on our website, think about carefully the way that we communicate about why the primary is important. We think it's important because that's where we pick who we're going to see on the general election. It's also important because sometimes there are offices, like city council is often decided in the primary. You might see it on the primary ballot and then maybe not on the general, for example. Or you might not see it on the primary, but do see it on the general. So there are a couple different variations there about what you might see. And I would just want folks to get in the habit, right? Think back. I would encourage you, think back to your first time that you voted in a primary, if you can remember it. Were you confused? Was there something on the ballot that you weren't sure about? Maybe you saw a state auditor and thought, I'm not going to vote in that office because I don't know what that person does. Sometimes you're going to have a little bit of confusion in the primary. But again, when we think about empowering student voters and building the habit of voting in the primary is the best indicator for if we can count on them to vote in the fall. And in voting in the fall is going to be snowballing into next year and the next year and the next year. And at least at You Can Vote, I think most people, I hope everyone here agrees, we want everyone to vote in every election that they're eligible. And so building that habit and making sure that folks know where to look, know which resources to trust, all these kind of mechanics of voting, thinking about how do you find your early voting site? How do I find my election day site? All of that empowers young people to go vote, and that helps build the habit of voting. And so that's what we're here to do. This Who Can Vote in the Primary is just one example of something I could ramble on about probably too long. So I want to dive into the offices that we're going to see this year. But if you have a question, or if you're not sure how to answer a question that you get from a student or even a family member, please make sure to ask me or look to our website. We do our very best to take what you see on the State Board of Elections website and put it into kind of bite-sized pieces. I do commend the State Board of Elections. We have a great North Carolina State Board of Elections website. Sometimes they have a whole lot of legalese information on their website, which is what we do, and take that legal information and turn it into something that is a little bit easier to digest for the average voter. So lean on us if there's anything that we can do to help you have these conversations with your campus. All right, so we're going to kick it off here. My favorite office always to talk about is county commissioner, right? Every single county in North Carolina has a county commission. Some of them are wards, and so they're depending on different district lines. Some of them are at-large seats. They can vary a little bit by the number of representatives that your county has. But my favorite office to talk about is county commissioner, because as you see, dollar bills, right? It comes down to money. These are folks that make decisions about funding and where your local dollars go. Maybe that's not the coolest thing to talk about right now. I know it's a presidential year, and I'll talk about president at the end, but think locally, right? When we think about the impact that we see from who's in office, the decisions that the county commissioners make in your county are critical, right? And elections are won by people who turn out, and decisions are made by people who are elected. So your county commissioners, they can pass a local budget that funds services. They fund our county board of elections, who administer our elections, which is important. They fund our public health and our health departments across the state. They can fund or allocate funding for safety programs, law enforcement, for county sheriff's offices, human services, public schools, and community colleges, especially too. Definitely community colleges probably are important to some of you working on those campuses. These offices are often people who maybe you don't know, maybe the students don't know all of them, right? Sometimes it's 5 or 7 different people on these boards, so sometimes they can be big. But these are people who live in our communities, right? Again, if you think about the county commissioners versus the president, you're not going to go grocery shopping with the president. You're not going to go grocery shopping even probably with your governor. You probably shop at the same grocery store that your county commissioners go to. Their kids are in the same schools that your kids are in. These are people who live in our communities and make really critical decisions about how our money is spent. And so I really encourage you to dive deep on county commission, think about what the priorities for funding that you find are important, or the student that you're talking to, the voter, and think about how the people running for this office align with your values. So that's one of the first offices I love to talk about. The next 2 are also local offices. I'm including mayors and city councils. Not everyone's going to have that this year. Most places in North Carolina vote for mayor and city council in odd years. So like Durham just had that election. But Greensboro, Winston-Salem, some places do have mayor and city council on the ballot in the primary. So I encourage you to think about that too, because again, local decisions are made by these local office holders. Mayors and city councils can decide what is being built where. So affordable housing is probably a big issue Generally, that's what we hear from young voters. Housing and health are the big issues that they care about, and local officials make those decisions. What can be built where, which apartments have to be a certain percentage of affordable housing, how often trash gets picked up, and how much our trash people are paid. Water and sewer, we just had this huge storm yesterday. I also hope everyone is safe from that. But when you think about storm pickup and cleanup and keeping our waterways clean on a local level, mayor and city council are really important for those kinds of decisions. Related soil and water conservation, a great office to talk about because it doesn't get a lot of attention. But these people can decide local priorities for conservation and protection of natural resources. So a lot of folks think about, again, president, Congress, governor, and those officials do make important decisions about the environment. But also soil and water conservation districts are on a local level, right? Again, these are folks that are probably at your local grocery store, shopping where you shop, going to college where you go to college. Oftentimes we see really young people running for these offices. So I encourage you to think through that office too, and think about how you can incorporate those candidates and highlighting this office as a really important local office. All right, I'm going to dive into some of the judicial races. Oftentimes we think of midterms as the biggest judicial race because that's when we vote for district attorneys generally and sheriff, and I understand why, but don't forget, we have the appeals court in North Carolina. This cycle in 2024, we have the state Supreme Court. There's one seat up for state Supreme Court. We also have district and superior court judges. Those are local judges in a courthouse near you that decide disputes on issues like money and personal injury. They settle divorce and child custody cases. They settle adoptions. They also settle all kinds of local cases in your community. Again, the district and superior court judges, the number of them that you will see varies by your county. And not all of them are on the same cycle. So you might have, 4 in your local courthouse, but they might not all be on the ballot this year. Again, I encourage you to look at your sample ballot. It does vary a little bit by location, but, and you may or may not see it on the primary. Again, that might be an office that you don't see until November, or vice versa. You might only see it on the primary and not in November. So those are those local judges. The Court of Appeals, we also have a Court of Appeals, including the Supreme Court. There are multiple Court of Appeals offices open this year. These are the people who review trial court from the lower courts. They can review state cases against the governor or the legislature. They interpret or overturn, again, statewide laws. Their decisions become the law. They're kind of the final step. The state Supreme Court is the final step for issues regarding state law. I would also just mention, especially if you're talking to young people, there's a whole lot of folks that don't know that we vote for state Supreme Court. And so drawing the distinction between the US Supreme Court and the North Carolina Supreme Court, we don't get to vote for who's on the US Supreme Court. We do for state though. These are 8-year terms, and there are 7 people on that court in North Carolina as opposed to 9 on the federal bench. And we get to vote for them. So again, in addition to county commissioner, usually I really dive into state Supreme Court. Today I'm going to keep moving though, because I know there's a lot more to get through. All right, so next I'm going to get into the Council of State, the NC Commissioner of Labor, right? This is most often people who know who this person is because their picture is in the elevator. So if you see someone, every time you get in an elevator, there's a security checklist. The inspection for elevators is done by our North Carolina Commissioner of Labor. But they also have other roles that they're due to help keep us safe. They conduct safety and health inspections. They investigate work-related accidents and deaths. And so that is a really important Council of State office. That's one person that covers the whole state, and that's a 4-year term. Same with Attorney General. That's a statewide office. They can represent the state in legal matters, decide when to bring lawsuits. The most recent case probably that a lot of folks would probably think about are some of the ones dealing with the opioid crisis and pollution of our water and airways. And so depending on which classroom you're talking to, or maybe you're talking to your SGA cohort of students and they are taking environmental science class, this is a great office to talk about, right? Again, yes, it's a presidential year, but all these other offices make a lot of important decisions based on those issues that people really care about. All right, Commissioner of Insurance, as well as Commissioner of Agriculture. Again, these are the Council of State offices. These are one person per office. It's a statewide and a 4-year term. Commissioner of Insurance can decide about which insurance companies can do business in North Carolina. Agriculture is really important in North Carolina, of course. We have a lot of farms and a lot of agriculture happening in North Carolina. And so both of these are really important in terms of who's allowed to do business, how to keep us all safe, which regulations to add or change or amend. And so both of these are really important office holders and make a lot of decisions that impact us. Maybe we don't know who they are, but now's the time, right? Let's talk about who these people are and the powers that they hold. Same with state auditor and superintendent of public instruction. These are statewide offices. They are appointed or elected for 4 years. The auditor can examine the records and files and finances of every single agency in North Carolina. They can see that our tax money is being used efficiently and effectively and legally. They also can do reports and bring awareness for any organizations that are wasting or abusing tax dollars. So state auditor is another one, Council of State office within the Council of State. Public instruction, public schools, right? They set the standards for what is taught for K through 12 schools. So maybe college students might not think this impacts them as much anymore. I would argue, though, that all of us are impacted by the public schools in North Carolina. All of us are either in communication or in relationship with young people. And even if we don't have kids of our own, they are in our neighborhoods. They are working at organizations. Maybe they're driving your Uber or delivering your pizza or helping to do park cleanups and plant trees in your local community. A lot of the programs and awareness for what public schools need comes from this statewide official, the superintendent of public instruction. State treasurer and the North Carolina Secretary of State, again, still in the Council of State offices. There's a lot on the ballot this year. These are also statewide and they are 4-year terms. The Secretary of State can approve the creation of corporations as well as nonprofits like ours. They can inform the business community about state requirements, and they can make sure that everyone is in compliance with tax codes and funding streams and a multitude of different things that impact our business community. State treasurer, of course, handles money, right? They can fund and provide medical benefits for our public school teachers and law enforcement. They do handle the retirement for our public school teachers and law enforcement. And so these are both 4-year terms for statewide positions. All right, another statewide position, lieutenant governor and governor will come up next. Lieutenant governor is, we are one of 17 states where their lieutenant governor runs separately from the governor. So some people think about this like the vice president, right? They're like second in command, but on a statewide level. And they can serve as a member of the Council of State, the North Carolina Board of Education, the North Carolina Capital Planning Commissioner, the North Carolina Board of Community Colleges, and serve as the chairman of the E-Learning Commission. So this person does have a lot of power, actually. They also can assume the governor's duties if the governor is unable to serve. And sometimes they even break ties or go vote in the General Assembly if needed. So we have the lieutenant governor in North Carolina as well as the governor. Those are separate offices. And so again, depending on which party's primary you vote in, you may see a long list of names in the primary separately from different parties. And then they'll face off again in the general election. It is very common in North Carolina for them to be from separate parties, as it is now in North Carolina. And then governor and president, I put these on the same because they are somewhat related in terms of their role. The governor, of course, is our local statewide leader. They can veto bills passed in the legislature. They can offer people pardons in state prisons. They decide how the state government buildings, vehicles, and operations impact the environment. So making decisions and leading policy on different environmental issues. They also appoint members to the State Board of Education and the State Board of Elections. So if you think about the county budgets, they handle County Board of Elections. We also have our State Board of Elections, and that is a statewide role that are appointed by the governor. And then, of course, the president. The president is a big draw this year. 2024 is a presidential year. And of course, that is a really, really impactful office. At You Can Vote, and if we come do presentations for you or your students, we sometimes don't even talk about the president as much because, as you can see, there's a whole lot of other offices. And I didn't even talk about every single one of them because they vary a little bit by county. But there's so many other offices on the ballot that don't get a lot of attention, right? I think a lot of the news coverage, I know the news coverage is focusing on president and vice president, but they will be on the primary for those three parties that have a primary this year, and then they will certainly be on the general election as well. And we could talk all about the president, but I think most people are familiar with that office. It does go with the vice president, but that is not a separate office. So left that off for this one. Then lastly, we have the U.S. House of Representatives. In North Carolina, we do not have a U.S. Senate race this year, but we do have all 14 seats for the Congress. And that is, of course, every 2 years. I will note again that we have 14 districts, not 13. And depending on where you live, you might be voting in the first time for your district because we have new maps. Those are still, some of them are still being litigated, but certainly it's definitely going to be 14 seats based on the Senate census data. So we increased our representation in Congress. So all 14 seats in North Carolina are up. And again, just depending on where you live, you might see lots of names on the primary and only one on the general or vice versa. Of course, there's lots of people running for Congress this year, but not every single district has as many. All right, last, then I'm happy to take lots of questions, but want to speed through here towards the end and make sure you have these reminders. When you're talking to young people, especially, it's important that folks know once you've done your research, once you've looked at your sample ballot, once you've thought about who you want to vote for, you can take in a printed or a digital list of your picks to remind yourself. So maybe that's on your phone, maybe you sent a note to yourself, maybe you printed off the names and brought them in with you. You are still allowed to bring that in. But there are rules about taking photos. So especially when you're talking to young people, right? People love to take the selfie. You're not allowed to take a selfie inside the voting enclosure, and you can't take a picture of your ballot. But we do encourage everyone, once they are done voting, once you're outside and done, that sticker selfie does help encourage turnout. And so once you're done, step outside, take that sticker selfie. Again, in a group is great, right? We'd love to see 4, 5, 10, 20 faces all on your campus voting together. Share it on social media, make sure people have the information. I would encourage you, every time you're talking about voting, include when the primary election is, March 5th, and the general election, November 5th. So don't just tell people to go vote. You have to give people the information that they need. What's on the ballot? When is it? What time are polls open? How do I find where the locations are? How do I get registered? And again, we have a communications toolkit coming soon that has a lot of sample messages that you could use. But one thing I would really encourage you to do when you're thinking about communicating with young people is don't assume that they know those little details and those kind of mechanics of voting, right? Include early voting dates as much as possible, include election dates as much as possible, and making sure people have the links that they need to make their sample ballot research a little bit easier. And then if you have any trouble, as always, North Carolina has a great election protection coalition. Many of you probably have seen the yellow signs around your local polling locations. If you experience long lines, intimidation, if there's problems with the poll workers, if an early voting site is packed and runs out of ballots, anything like that, contact the voter hotline number, as well as communicating with your county board of elections. That's a good pro tip. Also, if you're planning a march to the polls, give them a heads up, make sure that they have enough poll workers to handle, 300 students all marching down together to go vote. So those are a couple quick reminders. I'm happy to take additional questions. And I would just thank you again for talking about these pointers, as well as communicating your voting experience with young people, because we do find that that is one of the most effective ways to have these conversations. All right, so that's my name again.